The Complex Legacy of JFK, Unveiling the Missteps of a Far From Perfect President. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, embodies an era of hope and charisma but also navigated through a presidency fraught with challenges and misjudgments. This examination of 10 political errors aims to unveil the less discussed aspects of his administration, illustrating the complexities and pitfalls that marked his tenure as a far from perfect president. Fact number 1. The Bay of Pigs invasion, April 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion, executed from April 17 to 19, 1961, stands as a glaring testament to the perils of flawed intelligence and overconfidence in military solutions to geopolitical issues. The plan, inherited from the Eisenhower administration, aimed to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime by landing approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and funded by the CIA, on Cuba's southern coast. Kennedy, just 3 months into his presidency, approved the operation but vetoed air support to maintain plausible deniability of U.S. involvement. The invaders were quickly defeated by Castro's forces, leading to over 1,000 prisoners and a public relations disaster for the United States. This debacle not only solidified Castro's power but also pushed Cuba into closer alliance with the Soviet Union, laying the groundwork for the Cuban Missile Crisis and illustrating Kennedy's inexperience in managing covert operations. Number 2. Escalation in Vietnam. Kennedy's tenure saw a significant escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, a pivotal shift from advisors and support to active military engagement. When he took office in January 1961, there were approximately 800 military advisors in South Vietnam. By the time of his assassination in November 1963, that number had ballooned to 16,000. Kennedy, concerned about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, believed in the domino theory and felt that a communist victory in Vietnam would lead to further communist successes in neighboring countries. This increase in military personnel and support for the corrupt and unpopular government of Ngo Dinh Diem failed to stabilize South Vietnam and set the stage for the full-scale military involvement that would be realized under President Lyndon B. Johnson. The American commitment to Vietnam, deepened during Kennedy's presidency, ultimately led to one of the most divisive and painful chapters in American history. Number 3. The Vienna Summit Miscalculation, June 1961. The Vienna Summit, held on June 3 to 4, 1961, was a key meeting between President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, intended to address various Cold War tensions, including the status of Berlin and nuclear arms control. Kennedy, hoping to forge a path to peaceful coexistence, instead found himself outmaneuvered and intimidated by Khrushchev's aggressive stance. The Soviet leader threatened to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would end American, British, and French access to Berlin. Kennedy's inability to effectively counter Khrushchev's threats or to secure any significant concessions led to a perception of weakness, encouraging Khrushchev to erect the Berlin Wall in August 1961, physically dividing the city and symbolizing the Cold War divide between East and West. This summit and its aftermath significantly heightened U.S.-Soviet tensions, directly contributing to the Cuban Missile Crisis and illustrating the dangers of misjudging Soviet intentions and resolve. Number 4. Wiretapping Martin Luther King Jr. In a controversial move, President Kennedy, under the advisement of his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, authorized the FBI to wiretap Martin Luther King Jr., beginning in October 1963. The Kennedy administration harbored suspicions about communist influences on King, particularly through his associations with Stanley Levison, a lawyer and advisor. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had a notorious aversion to King, conducted the surveillance, ostensibly to unearth communist ties, but no substantial evidence was found. Instead, the FBI's focus shifted to discrediting King's moral authority, especially by exposing his extramarital affairs. This infringement on King's privacy and the broader civil rights movement's integrity demonstrates a significant ethical compromise by Kennedy's administration, reflecting the era's pervasive fear of communism and its impact on domestic policy decisions. Number 5. Overlooking comprehensive nuclear disarmament. The 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, signed on August 5, 1963, and effective from October 10, 1963, was a hallmark of Kennedy's presidency, prohibiting nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. While the treaty was a significant step toward curtailing the nuclear arms race, it fell short of achieving comprehensive nuclear disarmament. The treaty allowed for underground nuclear tests, a loophole that both the United States and the Soviet Union exploited to continue their arms development programs. Critics argue that Kennedy, while pioneering and negotiating the treaty, missed a crucial opportunity to push for more extensive measures that could have more effectively halted nuclear proliferation. The focus on a partial test ban, rather than a comprehensive ban, underscored the limitations of the era's disarmament efforts and the enduring tension between nuclear deterrence and global security. Number 6. The Cuban Missile Crisis Precipitation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, unfolding over 13 days in October 1962, is often cited as the closest the Cold War came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. The crisis was precipitated by the discovery of Soviet ballistic missile deployment in Cuba, a direct response to the American deployment of Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, and the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. Kennedy's aggressive stance toward Cuba, including the authorization of the invasion and subsequent Operation Mongoose, a covert operation aimed at overthrowing Castro's regime, significantly heightened tensions with the Soviet Union. These actions contributed to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, aiming to deter further U.S. aggression against the island. While Kennedy's resolution of the crisis through a naval blockade and secret negotiations, resulting in the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Turkey, is lauded, the events leading up to the standoff highlight a series of miscalculations that nearly resulted in nuclear conflict. Number 7. Strained relations with Charles de Gaulle. The relationship between President Kennedy and French President Charles de Gaulle was fraught with tension, primarily over differing views on the control and strategy of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the role of the United States in European security. De Gaulle, who served as President of France from 1959 to 1969, was critical of the U.S. dominance in NATO and sought to reassert France's sovereignty and leadership in Europe. This tension culminated in March 1966, when de Gaulle announced France's withdrawal from NATO's Integrated Military Command, a decision that led to the removal of NATO headquarters from Paris to Brussels. Although this event occurred after Kennedy's presidency, the roots of the discord can be traced back to Kennedy's tenure, highlighting a significant diplomatic rift between the U.S. and one of its key allies during the Cold War era. Number 8. Delay in supporting civil rights legislation. President Kennedy's approach to civil rights legislation was initially cautious, reflecting a political balancing act aimed at maintaining support from Southern Democrats who were largely opposed to civil rights reforms. It wasn't until June 11, 1963, in the wake of escalating racial tensions and the violent suppression of civil rights demonstrations, that Kennedy delivered a landmark speech advocating for comprehensive civil rights legislation. This address led to the proposal of the Civil Rights Act, which would be passed posthumously under President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. Kennedy's initial reluctance to aggressively pursue civil rights legislation reflected the complex political landscape of the early 1960s but ultimately delayed the progress of a critical social reform movement. Number 9. The Laos Crisis Mismanagement. The crisis in Laos, which escalated in 1961, presented an early foreign policy challenge for Kennedy. Laos, a small Southeast Asian country, had become a battleground for competing forces: the Communist Pathet Lao, supported by North Vietnam and the Soviet Union, and the Royal Lao government, backed by the U.S. Kennedy's administration, pursued a policy of neutrality for Laos, advocating for a neutralist government that would include all factions, in contrast to the more aggressive anti-communist stance advocated by some advisors. This approach culminated in the 1962 Geneva Agreement on Laos, which aimed to establish a neutral and independent Laos but ultimately failed to prevent North Vietnam from using Laotian territory to infiltrate South Vietnam. Critics argue that Kennedy's neutrality in Laos signaled weakness and encouraged further communist expansion in Southeast Asia. Number 10. The appointment of Lyndon B. Johnson as Vice President. Kennedy's selection of Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, as his running mate in 1960 was a strategic move aimed at securing victory in the presidential election by winning the southern states, where Johnson's influence as a senator from Texas was substantial. However, this decision also set the stage for a significant policy shift after Kennedy's assassination on November 22, 1963. LBJ's ascension to the presidency led to the escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, a dramatic departure from Kennedy's more cautious approach. While Kennedy had increased military advisors in Vietnam, it was under Johnson that the U.S. committed combat troops, leading to a full-scale military engagement. This escalation can be seen as an indirect consequence of Kennedy's decision to place Johnson on the ticket, highlighting the far-reaching implications of vice presidential selections.